"You are nothing! Get this woman out of my building right now!" Richard Sterling's voice exploded through the boardroom like a gunshot. He seized Sarah Mitchell's laptop and hurled it against the wall. He grabbed her presentation binder and shredded it in his bare hands, throwing the pages into her face while 12 board members sat frozen watching. Security guards rushed in. Richard pointed his finger 1 inch from her nose and snarled, "You should be grateful I ever let someone like you sit at this table." The room burst into applause. Sarah Mitchell said nothing. She straightened her jacket. She walked out. And Richard Sterling had exactly 72 hours left before everything he owned ceased to exist. Subscribe right now. Drop a comment with your city. I want to see how far this story reaches. Stay until the very end. What happens next will shake you. The boardroom on the 42nd floor of Sterling Hargrave Tower had floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the entire city. On a clear morning, you could see for 30 miles in every direction. Richard Sterling had designed it that way on purpose. He wanted everyone who sat across from him to feel small to understand, without a single word being spoken, that they were looking at his world and they were only visitors in it. That Tuesday morning in November, the room was full. 12 board members sat along the long obsidian table. 3 senior vice presidents stood near the back wall. 2 legal advisors were positioned near the door. And at the far end of the table, in the chair she had occupied for 11 years, sat Sarah Mitchell, Chief Operations Officer of Sterling Hargrave Capital, one of the most powerful financial holding companies in the northeastern United States. Sarah was 53 years old. She had silver threading through her dark hair that she had never bothered to hide. She wore a charcoal blazer, pressed slacks, and flat leather shoes, not because she couldn't afford heels, but because she spent her days walking through server rooms, financial departments, and operations floors, and she had learned long ago that comfort was a form of power. Her reading glasses were folded on top of a single manila folder in front of her. She had not opened a laptop. She had not brought a presentation. She had brought only the folder and her memory, which was the sharpest instrument in the entire building. Richard Sterling entered the room at 9:04, 4 minutes late, which was intentional. He was 61 years old, broad-shouldered, silver-haired, in a way that had been carefully cultivated by a stylist. He flew in from New York every 3 weeks. He wore a suit that cost more than most people's monthly salary. He walked into a room the way a weather system walked into a town preceding himself, filling the air before he arrived. He took his seat at the head of the table without greeting anyone. He poured himself a glass of water. He looked at his phone once, then he looked up. "Let's begin," he said. Marcus Webb, the chief financial officer, cleared his throat and opened his presentation, a 40-slide deck that had been prepared over the previous 72 hours. Sarah had not been included in its preparation. She had noticed that 3 days ago when the calendar invitations went out and her name was conspicuously absent from the working group. She had said nothing. She had simply started paying closer attention. The presentation was about restructuring. That was the word they used, restructuring. But Sarah had been in corporate finance for 28 years, and she knew what restructuring meant when it was presented in a certain tone, with certain slides at a certain kind of meeting. It meant someone was being cut. The only question was who. Marcus moved through the slides with the smooth efficiency of a man who had rehearsed his delivery carefully. Revenue projections, operational overhead analysis, departmental efficiency ratings, and then the slide that changed the temperature in the room. It was titled Executive Role Consolidation Phase 1. Sarah's name was on it. Not buried in a footnote, not hidden in a chart. Her name, her title, and a proposed effective date. December 1st, 6 weeks away, were right there in the center of the slide, formatted with the same clean corporate font as everything else, as if her 11-year career was simply a line item to be reorganized. She felt every eye in the room move toward her. She did not react. She kept her hands flat on the table. She kept her breathing even. She looked at the slide with the same expression she used when she was reviewing a vendor contract, attentive, analytical, and entirely unreadable. Richard watched her from the far end of the table, and something about her stillness seemed to irritate him more than any reaction could have. "Sarah," he said, cutting Marcus off mid-sentence. She looked at him. "You've seen the numbers," Richard said. "You understand what we're doing here." "I understand what's on the slide," she said. Her voice was calm, not cold calm. There was a difference, and everyone in the room heard it. "Then you understand that your role as currently structured is redundant." He leaned back in his chair. "We're bringing in a restructuring consultant from Meridian Partners, consolidated oversight, streamlined command. The COO function in its current form is no longer compatible with where this company is going." "Incompatible," she repeated as if tasting the word. "That's correct." She nodded slowly. She picked up her reading glasses and put them on. She opened the manila folder. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a printed document, one page which she placed on the table and turned to face the board. "Before we continue," she said, "I want to note for the record that the operational framework currently sustaining this company's financial infrastructure, including its authentication systems, vendor payment networks, compliance reporting protocols, and interdepartmental access controls was designed, built, and is maintained exclusively under my direct oversight." She paused. "I want to make sure the board understands that before any transition decisions are finalized." The room was quiet. Richard smiled. It was the smile of a man who believed he was about to win something. "Are you threatening us, Sarah?" "I'm informing you," she said. "There's a difference." Richard stood up. He buttoned his jacket. He walked slowly down the length of the table, slowly enough that every person in the room tracked him, which was exactly what he intended. He stopped when he was standing 2 seats away from Sarah, close enough to loom far enough to perform. "Let me be very clear," he said, his voice dropping into that register he used when he wanted the room to feel the weight of his authority. "Sterling Hargrave has a legal team, an IT department, a financial operations division, and 340 employees who keep this company running every single day. The idea that one person, any one person, is so essential that they cannot be replaced is a fantasy." He looked around the table, collecting silent agreement from the faces watching him. "And frankly, Sarah, the belief that you are irreplaceable is exactly the kind of organizational arrogance that has been slowing this company down." She looked at him steadily. She did not blink. "You built systems," he continued. "Systems can be rebuilt. You managed processes. Processes can be re-engineered. What you have not done in 11 years is made yourself indispensable in a way that this company cannot move forward from." He straightened his cuffs. "You're done here. Effective immediately, not December 1st. Today. Security will escort you out. HR will contact you about your severance package." There was a beat of silence so total that the air conditioning hum above the ceiling tiles became audible. Then Marcus Webb laughed. It was a short, sharp laugh, the kind that escapes before the brain can catch it. And once Marcus laughed, 2 of the board members chuckled quietly, and one of the senior vice presidents exhaled through his nose in a way that was almost contemptuous. It was the sound of a room full of people who had agreed in advance on how this moment was going to go. Sarah did not laugh. She did not argue. She removed her reading glasses. She closed the manila folder. She stood up deliberately without rushing, and she straightened her jacket. She picked up the folder, and she looked at Richard Sterling for a long moment, not with anger, not with hurt, with something that was harder to categorize, something that made 2 of the quieter board members shift slightly in their seats without understanding why. "All right," she said. That was all. She walked to the door. She opened it. She stepped out. The door closed behind her with a quiet, precise click, the sound of a well-engineered latch catching perfectly in its housing. Inside the boardroom, Marcus Webb said, "Well, that was easier than I expected." Richard Sterling sat back down. He poured himself more water. "Always is," he said, "when people realize they don't have a choice." What no one in that room saw was what Sarah did in the 47 seconds between leaving the boardroom door and reaching the elevator bank at the end of the hall. She did not call anyone. She did not text anyone. She reached into the inner pocket of her blazer and removed a small USB drive, matte black, no branding, the size of a thumb joint. She held it in her palm for exactly 3 seconds. Then she put it back. She pressed the elevator button. She waited. When the doors opened, she stepped inside. As the elevator descended, she looked at her reflection in the brushed steel doors, and for the first time since she had entered the building that morning, her expression changed. Not to tears, not to anger, to something that looked very faintly like relief. Sarah Mitchell had joined Sterling Hargrave 11 years ago as Director of Operational Systems, a title that made her sound like a middle manager, but which in practice meant something much more significant. Richard Sterling had hired her specifically because the company's infrastructure was a disaster, overlapping vendor contracts, fragmented financial systems, authentication protocols that were built by 3 different contractors over a decade, and which communicated with each other imperfectly and expensively. He had brought Sarah in to fix it. She had fixed it, more than fixed it. Over the course of 4 years, she had rebuilt the company's entire operational backbone from the ground up. She had designed a centralized financial authentication system that governed access to every account, every vendor relationship, every internal financial instrument the company operated. She had negotiated and structured vendor contracts that were tied specifically to her oversight protocols. She had built compliance reporting systems that automatically filed with regulatory bodies on quarterly schedules. She had created what the IT department privately called the Cathedral, a layered, elegant, interdependent system of controls that kept Sterling Hargrave's enormous financial machinery running with a precision that most of the people benefiting from it didn't even notice. That was the thing about truly excellent operational design. It made itself invisible. When everything works, nobody asks why. Nobody asks how. Nobody wonders what would happen if the person who built it were no longer there. Nobody, that is, except the person who built it. Sarah had always known this moment might come. She had worked for Richard Sterling long enough to understand that his loyalty was situational and his gratitude had a shelf life. She had watched him push out 6 senior executives over the years, some loudly, some quietly, all of them with the same fundamental logic: once you're no longer useful in the way he needs you to be useful, you're a liability. Richard didn't keep liabilities. What Richard had failed to understand, what he had always failed to understand, because his particular kind of intelligence was brilliant at acquisition and terrible at infrastructure, was that there was a profound difference between a person who does a job and a person who builds the system that makes every other job possible. Sarah was the latter, and she had spent 4 years building something that to the untrained eye looked like a corporate operations platform. But to anyone who understood its architecture, it was something else entirely. It was a system with a very specific feature built into its deepest layer, a feature that Sarah had documented, nowhere mentioned to no one, and activated only twice in 11 years as a test. The technical term for it in the narrow field of systems architecture where such things were discussed was a dead man's switch. In practice, it meant this: the system required active confirmation from a specific credentialed administrator, Sarah, on a rolling 72-hour cycle to maintain standard operational status. That confirmation was not a password. It was not a biometric scan. It was a physical key, the USB drive in Sarah's jacket pocket, combined with a login sequence performed from an authenticated device on a specific internal IP address. If that confirmation was not entered within 72 hours, the system did not crash. It did not go dark. It did something far more precise and far more damaging. It entered what Sarah had labeled in her private documentation as preservation mode. In preservation mode, the system did exactly what its name implied. It preserved everything. It locked all financial accounts at their current balances. It froze all outgoing transfers. It copied and encrypted every internal communication log, every financial record, and every transaction history from the previous 36 months into a sealed, time-stamped archive that could only be accessed with a court order. It suspended all external vendor authentication. And it sent automated notification packages to a list of recipients that Sarah had spent 2 years carefully and quietly compiling. That list included the Securities and Exchange Commission's Enforcement Division, the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Financial Crimes Unit, 2 federal prosecutors whose names had appeared in a case 4 years ago involving a company with similar structural characteristics to Sterling Hargrave, and a partner at a whistleblower law firm in Washington, D.C., whose retainer Sarah had quietly maintained for 14 months. Sarah had not built this system in anger. She had not built it in anticipation of revenge. She had built it the way she built everything methodically, with precise attention to consequence, because she had been watching Richard Sterling's financial decisions for 3 years, and she had understood with the cold clarity of someone who sees numbers the way other people see words, that what was happening inside Sterling Hargrave was not aggressive, but legal financial strategy. It was fraud. Systematic, documented, and escalating fraud. She had tried to stop it the right way first. She had gone to Marcus Webb with documentation 18 months ago. Marcus had listened carefully and then told her she was misreading the instruments. She had gone to 2 board members. One had stopped returning her calls. The other had told her gently and with what seemed like genuine concern that she might want to be careful about the conclusions she was drawing. She had sent a flagged report through the company's internal compliance system. The report had been received logged and then somehow inexplicably impossibly deleted. After the deletion, she had understood. This wasn't something she could fix from the inside. There was no inside anymore. The inside had been compromised, so she had stopped trying to fix it from inside, and she had started building the archive. She cleared her desk in 31 minutes. Her office was on the 38th floor, 4 floors below the boardroom, a deliberate architectural statement of hierarchy that Richard had never commented on and which Sarah had never mentioned. The office was large but not extravagant. 2 walls were floor-to-ceiling shelving, filled with binders, technical manuals, and stacked folders. Her desk was clean in the way that only deeply organized people can maintain, not bare but ordered. Everything with a specific place and a specific reason for being there. She had a banker's box ready. She had in fact had it ready for 6 weeks. It was stored in the bottom drawer of her credenza, folded flat, assembled and filled in the 12 minutes before she left for the boardroom that morning. She filled it methodically. Her personal items, a photograph, 2 books, a small ceramic mug that her daughter had painted for her years ago in elementary school, her personal hard drive, which contained only personal files and which she had already audited 3 times to confirm it held nothing proprietary, a small leather-bound notebook, a phone charger. Her assistant, a young man named David Park, knocked on the open door as she was sealing the box. "Ms. Mitchell." He stopped. He looked at the box. He looked at her face. He was 26 years old and had worked for her for 2 years, and he had the specific quality of emotional intelligence that made him an exceptional assistant. He understood what he was seeing without needing it, explained. "What happened?" "The meeting went in a different direction than anticipated," she said. "They fired you." It wasn't a question. "I'm transitioning out," she said, "effective immediately." David stared at her. His jaw was tight. He was a young man who felt things strongly and was still learning how to manage that in a professional context, which was something Sarah had been quietly coaching him on for 18 months and which she now saw playing out in real time across his face. "That's insane," he said. "This whole company runs because of you. They have no idea." "David," her voice was quiet, "you are going to be fine. You're excellent at what you do. Whoever comes in after me is going to need someone who knows how this place operates, and you know it better than most people on any of these floors." She picked up the box. "I need you to do something for me. Anything. Go home tonight. Take care of yourself. And whatever happens in the next few days, don't panic. Just watch. And remember that things that look chaotic from the inside often look very different from the outside." He stared at her. "What does that mean?" She smiled at him. It was a small smile, but it was real. "It means you're going to be all right." She walked to the elevator. She rode down to the lobby. She nodded to the security guard at the desk, a man named Gerald who had worked the front desk for 9 years and who looked at the banker's box in her arms with an expression of genuine shock. And then before she reached the revolving doors said, "Ms. Mitchell, I'm sorry." "Thank you, Gerald," she said. "Have a good day." She walked through the revolving doors. She stepped onto the sidewalk. The November air hit her face cold and sharp and real. She did not stop walking. She did not look back at the tower behind her. She walked 1 block north, then turned east, then walked another 3 blocks to a small coffee shop on a side street that she had used as a second office on mornings when the building felt too compressed. She sat down at a corner table. She ordered a black coffee. She set the banker's box on the floor beside her chair. She took the USB drive out of her jacket pocket and looked at it one more time. 72 hours. That was the window. The system was running its normal confirmation cycle, and the last confirmation she had entered had been yesterday at 8:47 in the morning, which meant the next confirmation window would close at 8:47 tomorrow morning. She was not going to enter that confirmation. She put the USB drive back in her pocket. She picked up her coffee. She looked out the window at the street, at the people moving past in their coats, and their urgency going about their ordinary Tuesday. She had 48 hours to wait. She was good at waiting. She had been waiting for a long time. Richard was in excellent spirits. He ordered lunch brought up to the boardroom. He talked expansively about the restructuring plan, about the consultant from Meridian Partners who would begin on Monday, about the new operational model that would be leaner and more responsive, and the word he used 3 times, liberated. Liberated from legacy thinking. Liberated from overcomplicated systems, liberated from the institutional inertia that built up around long-tenured executives who confused familiarity with competence. Nobody in the room said anything about Sarah Mitchell after she left. Not her name, not her work. She had been there 11 years, and within 40 minutes of her departure, her name had been retired from the conversation entirely. This was, if you understood the men in that room, entirely predictable. It was also, if you understood what Sarah had built in the floors below them, the most dangerous silence imaginable. Because what was quietly beginning to happen in the server infrastructure 6 floors below the boardroom had nothing to do with what anyone in that room was saying. It had everything to do with what Sarah had already done, years ago, carefully, without anyone knowing. The clock was running. And on the 42nd floor, surrounded by his board and his lunch and his certainty, Richard Sterling had absolutely no idea. At 4:17 that afternoon, a junior IT analyst named Kevin Cho was running a routine systems check when he noticed something that didn't belong in the log. A minor authentication flag, the kind of micro alert that usually indicated a software update conflict or a network handshake failure. Ordinarily, Kevin would have logged it and moved on. These things happened multiple times a week in a system as large as Sterling Hargrave's infrastructure. But this flag was different. This flag was on the primary financial authentication gateway, the master access controller that governed every financial account the company touched. And it wasn't reporting a handshake failure. It was reporting something Kevin had never seen before in 2 years of working in this system. It was reporting a countdown. Kevin stared at the screen for a full 30 seconds before he picked up his phone and called his department head. "Hey," he said when the call connected, "I need you to come look at something." "What is it?" Kevin looked at the screen again. The counter was running. He could see it a small, precise, inexorable sequence of diminishing numbers embedded in a subroutine that had no label and no documentation in any technical manual he had ever read. "I don't know," he said slowly, "but I think it's been here for a long time, and I think it's—" He paused. "I think it's counting down to something." Kevin Cho had been staring at that countdown for 6 minutes before his department head, a heavy-set man named Tom Briggs, finally pushed through the glass door of the server monitoring room and leaned over his shoulder. "Where?" Tom said. Kevin pointed at the screen. Tom squinted. Then Tom pulled up a chair and sat down hard, like his legs had decided the situation required it. "That's embedded in the primary gateway," Tom said. "Yeah. That's not a standard subroutine." "No." Tom leaned closer. He clicked through 3 layers of the system architecture, navigating with the practiced speed of someone who had spent 15 years in IT infrastructure. He stopped when he reached the subroutine's origin signature. He read the timestamp. He read it again. "This was written 4 years ago," Tom said. "I know." "By who?" Kevin looked at him. He didn't answer because they both already knew. There was only one person in this building who worked at that level of the system's foundation. There was only one person who had ever had the clearance, the knowledge, and the access to embed something this deep and this invisible into Sterling Hargrave's operational core. Tom picked up his phone. His hand was not entirely steady. "I need to call upstairs," he said. "Who are you calling?" Tom paused. He thought about that for a moment, genuinely thought about it, because the normal chain of command in this situation would have been to call the Chief Operations Officer, and the Chief Operations Officer had been walked out of the building approximately 4 hours and 22 minutes ago. "I don't know yet," Tom said. And that in itself was the first sign that something was genuinely wrong. It was 6:47 in the evening. Most of the executive floor had emptied out. Richard Sterling had left at 5:30 in an excellent mood, heading to dinner at a restaurant where he had a standing reservation and where the maitre d' knew his name and his preferred table and the specific temperature at which he liked his first glass of wine. Marcus Webb had left shortly after. The board members had dispersed to their cars and their homes and their ordinary Tuesday evenings. The building was running on its overnight skeleton crew when Tom Briggs finally reached the Senior Vice President of Technology, a man named Daniel Forsyth, on his cell phone. Daniel was in his car 20 minutes from home when the call came through. He listened to Tom for 45 seconds. Then he said, "I'm turning around." He was back at the building in 19 minutes. He stood in front of Kevin's screen and looked at the countdown for a long time without speaking. The counter was embedded in a subroutine that linked directly to the financial authentication gateway, and the numbers were moving with the patient mechanical certainty of something that had been set in motion a long time ago and had absolutely no interest in being stopped. 43 hours, 17 minutes, and some seconds. "What happens when it hits zero?" Daniel asked. Kevin had spent the last 2 hours trying to answer exactly that question. He had traced every line of the subroutine's code that he could access, which was not all of it. Portions were encrypted in a cipher he had never encountered, but what he could read was enough to give him a general picture, and the general picture was not comforting. "Best I can tell," Kevin said carefully, "it triggers a system-wide state change. Every financial account goes to read-only. All outgoing transfers get suspended. All internal authentication tokens get invalidated, which means nobody can log into the financial systems from any device that isn't pre-authorized at the hardware level." He paused. "And then it looks like it initiates some kind of external communication protocol. But I can't see who it's communicating with. That part's completely encrypted." Daniel stared at the screen. "Can we stop it? I've been trying for 2 hours. And..." Kevin turned and looked at him directly. "The code is authenticated with a key I don't have. Any attempt to overwrite or disable the subroutine without the correct key triggers an immediate acceleration of the countdown. I tried a test interrupt 20 minutes ago on an isolated copy." He pulled up a second window. "It dropped the counter by 6 hours in about 4 seconds. The room was very quiet. "So if we try to force stop it," Daniel said slowly, "we make it worse. Much worse. Faster." Daniel stood up straight. He put both hands on top of his head, which was something he did when he was working through a problem that exceeded his comfort zone. "Who built this?" Kevin said nothing. Daniel turned and looked at him. "Kevin, you know who built this, Daniel." Another silence. Longer this time. Daniel took out his phone again. His thumb hovered over the screen for a moment. Then he made a decision that he understood, even as he made it, might be the most consequential professional decision of his career. He called Richard Sterling. Richard answered on the 4th ring, which meant he was at dinner and had looked at the caller ID and almost let it go to voicemail. His voice carried the slight elevated warmth of a man who had had 1 glass of wine and was in the middle of a pleasant evening and did not want to be interrupted. "Daniel, it's after 7. "I know, I'm sorry. I'm back at the building." Daniel turned away from Kevin and walked to the far corner of the room. He kept his voice low, but not so low that Kevin couldn't hear him. "We have a situation in the system infrastructure. Something that needs your immediate attention." A beat. "What kind of situation?" Daniel searched for the right word. "There's a scheduled system event that appears to have been built into the financial authentication platform. We don't know exactly what it does when it completes, but it's on a countdown, and we can't disable it without our existing credentials." Another beat. Longer. The restaurant sounds behind Richard's voice went slightly quieter, as if he had moved away from the table. "A countdown," Richard said. "Yes. How long?" 43 hours, give or take." The silence on the other end of the line lasted long enough that Daniel checked his phone screen to confirm the call was still connected. "Who built it?" Richard asked. His voice had changed. The dinner warmth was entirely gone. Daniel said nothing. "Daniel." The voice was very quiet now, very controlled. "Who built it? We believe it's consistent with the architecture that Sarah Mitchell." The sound Richard Sterling made was not a word. It was something between a laugh and something harder, and it lasted only half a second before his voice came back fully professional and fully cold. "Get Marcus on the phone. Get legal on the phone. I want everyone at the office at 8 tomorrow morning, and find out if there is any way to contact Sarah Mitchell." "Sir, should we—" 8 o'clock, Daniel." The call ended. Daniel stood holding his phone in the empty corner of the server room for a moment. Then he turned around. Kevin Cho was watching him with the expression of a young man who understood clearly that the situation was serious and was trying to figure out exactly how serious. "Well," Kevin said. "We have a meeting at 8, Daniel said. "Keep watching that counter. If anything changes, anything at all, you call me directly. Not the help desk, me." Kevin nodded. He turned back to the screen. The counter moved without drama or ceremony 1 second at a time, each number replaced by the next with the quiet, absolute indifference of a machine that didn't know or care what was at stake. 43 hours, 4 minutes. Daniel walked out. The door closed behind him. Kevin sat alone with the countdown and the specific hollow feeling of being the only person in a very large building who fully understood that something irreversible had already begun. At 9:14 that evening, Sarah Mitchell was sitting at the kitchen table of her apartment, a modest, well-ordered space on the 14th floor of a building 12 blocks from Sterling Hargrave Tower, when her personal cell phone rang. She looked at the number. It was not one she recognized, but the area code was local, and something about the timing told her she should answer. "This is Sarah," she said. A pause. Then a voice she recognized, young, careful, slightly breathless. "Ms. Mitchell, it's Kevin Cho, from IT." She set down her tea. "Kevin." "I'm sorry to call your personal number. David Park gave it to me. I hope that's—" "It's fine. What happened?" Another pause. She could hear him choosing his words. "I found something in the system today, after you left. A subroutine in the financial gateway, with a countdown." He stopped. "I think you know what I'm talking about." Sarah was quiet for a moment. Outside her window, the city moved through its night routines indifferent and continuous. "How long have you been in IT, Kevin?" she asked. 2 years. "You're good at your job." "Miss Mitchell." "Kevin." Her voice was gentle but absolute. "I can't have this conversation with you. Not tonight. Not on this phone." She paused. "I want you to do something for me. Write down everything you've observed tonight, times readings, everything you tried, and what happened when you tried it. Put it in a personal document, not on the company system, your personal email, your personal device. Can you do that?" A long pause. "Why?" "Because in a few days, someone official is going to want to talk to someone who was in that room tonight, and when they do, you're going to want to have a clear record." She let that land. "Will you do that?" She could hear him breathing. She could hear him understanding something. "Yes," he said finally. "Good. Go home, Kevin. Get some sleep." She ended the call. She sat for a moment with the phone in her hand. Then she picked up her tea again. She looked at the window. She thought about Richard Sterling at his dinner table, and about the call he had almost certainly just made, and about the very specific kind of panic that was going to begin its work on him tonight, and accelerate with beautiful mechanical precision over the next 40 hours. She did not feel satisfaction. That was the thing people would misunderstand later, when the story became public. They would assume she felt triumphant. They would assume this moment, this quiet apartment, this cup of tea, this phone in her hand was the moment of revenge she had been waiting for. It wasn't. It was just the moment when the thing that needed to happen finally had room to happen, like opening a window in a room that has been sealed too long. Not triumph, just air. She finished her tea. She washed the cup. She went to bed. Richard Sterling did not sleep that night. He arrived at the office at 6:45, 90 minutes before the meeting he had called, and he went directly to the server room where Kevin Cho was still sitting. Kevin had not gone home, as it turned out, because he was 24 years old and had found a live countdown timer embedded in a billionaire's financial infrastructure, and go home and sleep was not a thing his nervous system was capable of processing as a legitimate option. Richard looked at the screen. He looked at the counter. 36 hours, 41 minutes. He turned to Kevin. "Can you reverse it?" Kevin looked at him with the careful, neutral expression of a technician who has learned not to deliver bad news with any detectable emotion. Not without the authentication key. Any forced intervention accelerates the countdown. "How do you know that?" "I tested it. It dropped 6 hours and 4 seconds. Richard looked at the screen again. His jaw was working slightly the way it did when he was containing something large. "What does it do when the counter hits 0? Kevin explained it: the asset freeze, the transfer suspension, the authentication lockout. He left out the part about the external communication protocol because he still didn't know exactly what it communicated or to whom, and he had learned enough in the last 12 hours to understand that the absence of information was sometimes more powerful than its presence. Richard listened without interrupting. When Kevin finished, he said nothing for a full 10 seconds. Then he turned and walked out of the server room without another word. By 8 o'clock, the conference room on the 42nd floor was full. Marcus Webb, Daniel Forsyth, 3 members of the legal team, the head of financial operations, a woman named Patricia Hale, who had arrived with a printout of the company's pending transfer schedule, and an expression of barely contained alarm, 2 outside counsel attorneys who had been reached at home and who had arrived in suits they had clearly put on very quickly. Richard sat at the head of the table. His face was composed. His hands were flat on the table. He looked to anyone who didn't know him well like a man in complete control of a challenging situation. Marcus Webb, who had known him for 16 years, recognized the specific flatness in his eyes as something closer to fear. "Options," Richard said. "Give me options." The first attorney, a compact, precise woman named Eileen Garza, spoke first. "We need to know the exact scope of what this system can do. If it's triggering a financial lockdown, we have potential regulatory exposure depending on how the lockdown presents to external institutions." "Explain that," Richard said. "If your accounts freeze in a way that looks like a solvency event, your banking partners get notified automatically. That triggers a review process." She paused. "Depending on what they find when they review." "What they find is a healthy, fully compliant financial institution," Richard said. Eileen Garza looked at him for a moment without blinking. "Of course," she said, "but the review process itself is visible, and visible review processes attract attention." The room was quiet. Patricia Hale cleared her throat. "There are 14 pending transfers scheduled for the next 36 hours. Combined value is approximately $240 million. If the system locks before those transfers complete..." She looked at her printout. 3 of them involve offshore accounts in jurisdictions that require transfer completion within a specific window to maintain their legal structure. If those transfers don't go through on schedule... "Fix the schedule," Richard said. "Move them up. Complete them today." Patricia looked at Daniel Forsyth. Daniel looked at the table. "We can't access the transfer authorization system. Kevin tried this morning. The authentication gateway is already showing pre-lockdown behavior. We can initiate transfers, but they're not completing. They're queuing and then timing out." The room absorbed this. Richard's hands, flat on the table, pressed slightly harder. "So the system is already affecting operations," Marcus said. It was not a question. "Yes," Daniel said. "Since about 2 hours ago. It's not a full lockdown yet, but the pre-lockdown state is already interrupting normal functions." Marcus turned to Richard. "We need to contact Sarah." "No," Richard said immediately. "Richard," I said no. His voice was quiet and absolute. "We are not going to call Sarah Mitchell and hand her this conversation. We are going to find another way." "There isn't another way," Marcus said. He kept his voice level, but didn't back down, which took a specific kind of courage that Richard rarely inspired in the people around him. "She built this. She's the only one who can undo it. We call her, we offer her whatever she needs, we bring her back, we pay her, we..." "She doesn't want money," Richard said. The room went still. It was the most honest thing Richard Sterling had said in that room in years, and everyone present felt the weight of it. felt what it implied, felt what it meant that he knew it without being told, felt what it revealed about what he understood. At some level, he rarely visited about what he had done to her. "Then what does she want?" Eileen Garza asked quietly. Richard said nothing. Outside the conference room windows, the city was fully awake now, moving through its Wednesday morning with the oblivious energy of a world that didn't know what was happening 42 floors above it. Thousands of people passing through the shadow of the tower, going about their ordinary lives, having no idea that the man who had built that tower and put his name on it and organized his entire identity around it was sitting in a room at its top, watching a clock count down to the end of everything he had constructed. 35 hours, 22 minutes. It was Marcus who finally broke the silence, and what he said changed the temperature of the room in a way that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. "Richard," he said slowly, "the offshore transfers, the ones Patricia mentioned, the ones that need to complete in the next 36 hours. He stopped. "Those aren't standard operational transfers, are they?" Richard looked at him. "I've been looking at them this morning," Marcus continued. His voice was very careful, very even. "While we were waiting for the meeting, I pulled the full transfer documentation." He set a folder on the table. He did not open it. "I've been CFO of this company for 7 years. I have never seen those accounts before. Those aren't on any financial statement I've signed. They're not in any audit I've reviewed." He paused. "What are those accounts, Richard?" The room was completely silent. Richard Sterling looked at Marcus Webb for a long moment. A long, specific assessing moment, the kind of look that a man gives when he is calculating exactly how much someone knows and exactly how much damage that knowledge can do. "This is not the time," Richard said finally. "I think this is exactly the time," Marcus said, "because if this system locks and freezes those accounts and files, some kind of automated report with a regulatory body, and those accounts contain what I think they might contain, then our problem is not Sarah Mitchell's countdown timer." His voice dropped. "Our problem is what the timer exposes when it goes off." Another silence, the longest one yet. Eileen Garza, the attorney, very quietly pushed her chair back approximately 3 inches from the table. It was a small movement. Nobody commented on it, but everyone noticed it. "I think," she said carefully, "that I need to understand more about the scope of what we're discussing before I can continue providing advice in this setting." She was in the language of attorneys beginning to protect herself, and everyone in the room who understood that language heard it and understood what it meant and felt the floor beneath the meeting shift in a way that had nothing to do with the building's foundation. 34 hours, 58 minutes. The counter moved, 1 second at a time, patient, mechanical absolute, counting toward a moment that Sarah Mitchell had designed years ago in a server room 4 floors below, where they were sitting with the quiet, meticulous precision of someone who understood that the truth properly preserved will always outlast the people trying to bury it. And in her apartment 12 blocks away, Sarah Mitchell was drinking her second cup of coffee and reading the news and waiting with all the calm of someone who had already done the hard part for the world to catch up to what she knew. 34 hours, 58 minutes on the counter, and the conference room on the 42nd floor had transformed into something that no longer resembled a business meeting. It resembled a pressure cooker with the valve welded shut. Eileen Garza had pushed her chair back 3 inches. That small movement had said everything. Marcus Webb's folder sat on the table, still closed, but its presence was now the heaviest object in the room. Richard Sterling had not moved. He sat at the head of the table with his hands flat and his jaw set, and the particular quality of his stillness had shifted from controlled authority into something that looked to anyone watching carefully, like a man standing very still because movement might cause something to break. Patricia Hale broke first. Not dramatically, she simply gathered her transfer documentation printout, aligned it precisely with the edge of the table, and said in a voice completely devoid of inflection, "I need to consult with my personal attorney before this conversation continues." She stood. She nodded to no one in particular. She left. The door closed behind her with the same quiet precision as Sarah Mitchell's door had closed the morning before. 1 floor, 24 hours, and an entirely different set of consequences. Marcus watched her go. Then he looked back at Richard. That's 2 attorneys distancing themselves in this room in the last 10 minutes. Do you understand what's happening here?" "I understand perfectly well what's happening," Richard said. "Then explain it to me. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like we have a system that is actively preventing us from moving money that nobody in this company officially knows about, and it's counting down to a moment where that information becomes visible to people we do not want it to be visible to." Marcus leaned forward. "Tell me I'm wrong." Richard said nothing. "Tell me those accounts are legitimate," Marcus said. His voice cracked slightly on the last word, not from emotion exactly, but from the specific strain of a man who has spent 16 years not asking certain questions and who is now for the first time asking them out loud. "Tell me those transfers are compliant. Tell me there's a paper trail that explains every dollar. Tell me that, Richard, right now, and I will stay in this room and help you fix this." The silence that followed was 10 seconds long. Richard Sterling looked at his CFO of 16 years, a man he had hired, mentored, promoted, trusted, and he said nothing. And that nothing was the most complete answer Marcus Webb had ever received in his professional life. Marcus closed his eyes for exactly 2 seconds. When he opened them, something had changed in his face. It was not anger. It was not shock. It was the expression of a man who had known somewhere very deep and very quiet for a long time, and who had just stopped pretending he didn't. He picked up the folder. He stood. "I'm going to need to make some calls," he said. "Privately." He walked out. Richard Sterling was left at the head of his conference table with one remaining outside counsel attorney, a young man named Brett Calloway, who had been silent for the entire meeting, and who now looked as though he was deeply reconsidering his career choices. Daniel Forsyth sat across from Calloway looking at the table. 2 junior associates hovered near the door. Richard looked at Brett. "Find out how to reach Sarah Mitchell." Brett blinked. "Sir, her personal number, her address, whatever we have in HR." He pushed back from the table. "Set up a meeting, today." What should I tell her the meeting is about?" Richard stood. He straightened his jacket with the precise automatic gesture of a man whose hands needed something to do. "Tell her we want to discuss a consulting arrangement." He paused at the door. "Tell her whatever you need to tell her. Just get her in a room." He walked out before Brett could respond. It was 9:47 in the morning, 26 hours and 13 minutes since Sarah had left the building, and the countdown had crossed below 34 hours, while Richard Sterling walked down the hall toward his private office, not knowing that 2 floors below him in a cubicle in the financial operations department, a junior analyst named Amy Torres had just discovered something that was going to make everything significantly worse. Amy Torres was 28 years old, methodical, and possessed of the specific professional conscientiousness that makes someone check things twice, even when nobody is asking them to. She had come in at 7 that morning to prepare the weekly vendor payment report, which was a routine document that normally took her 90 minutes to compile and which she had completed dozens of times without incident. That morning, it had taken her 3 hours, and she still wasn't finished because the payment system was returning errors she had never seen before. Not crashes the system was running. It was simply refusing to process outgoing payments. Every vendor invoice she tried to push through came back with the same response code: Authentication Gateway Suspended Pending System State Resolution. She had called the IT help desk at 7:45. The help desk had told her they were aware of a system issue and were working on it. She had called back at 8:30. Same answer. She had called at 9:15, and the person who answered had a tone in their voice that sounded to Amy's finely calibrated professional antenna like someone who was managing information rather than sharing it. So Amy had stopped calling the help desk and had started pulling payment records herself. Not the current queue, the historical records. She pulled 18 months of vendor payment data and ran a comparison against the vendor master list and the accounts payable ledger, because when a system does something unexpected, Amy's instinct was always to look at the past before diagnosing the present. What she found in the historical records stopped her cold. There were payment records in the system that did not appear in the accounts payable ledger, not small amounts. The discrepancies she was looking at were structured in a very specific way, amounts just under the threshold that triggered mandatory dual approval review, distributed across dozens of vendor codes, recurring on irregular schedules that avoided any pattern a routine audit would flag. But when you pulled 18 months of data and mapped it the way Amy was mapping it now, the pattern was not invisible at all. It was, in fact, extremely clear. She sat very still for a moment. Then she opened a new spreadsheet on her personal laptop, not her work computer, and started copying numbers. She did not call the help desk. She did not call Daniel Forsyth. She did not call anyone inside the building. She thought about what Ms. Mitchell had been like, the woman who had approved her hire 3 years ago, who had stopped by her desk twice to ask how she was settling in, who had always treated the junior analysts like people whose observations were worth hearing. She thought about what she'd heard this morning through the office grapevine about the counter in the server room and what it was connected to. And she thought about a phone number she had saved 18 months ago after attending a company compliance briefing, the SEC's whistleblower hotline, which the presenter had mentioned almost in passing, clearly not expecting anyone to write it down. Amy Torres had written it down. She saved her spreadsheet to a personal cloud account. She closed her work laptop. She picked up her personal phone and walked to the stairwell where the ambient noise of the building's HVAC system would make her voice harder to pick up on any ambient recording system. At 10:14 in the morning, Amy Torres made a call that lasted 11 minutes. She did not know at the time that she was not the first person to make that call in connection with Sterling Hargrave Capital. She did not know that the line she was calling had already received a notification package 17 months ago from a whistleblower protection filing that included her company's name, a summary of financial irregularities, and documentation of 3 years of internal evidence. She did not know any of that. What she knew was that she had found something that wasn't right, and that the person who had spent 11 years building the system that should have prevented it had been thrown out of the building yesterday morning, and that the people who remained didn't seem to know or care what that meant. She was wrong about one thing: they cared enormously. They simply cared for entirely the wrong reasons. At 11:30 that same morning, Sarah Mitchell's personal cell phone rang. She looked at the number. She recognized the Washington, D.C. area code. She answered. "Ms. Mitchell," said the voice on the other end. It was a woman's voice, precise, professional, unhurried. "This is Special Agent Renata Okafor with the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit. We've been expecting to speak with you." Sarah set down her coffee cup. "I've been expecting your call as well," she said. "I imagine you have." A pause. "I'm going to be direct with you. We received an automated notification this morning from a monitoring protocol associated with your whistleblower filing from 14 months ago. That protocol appears to have entered an active state at approximately 8:46 this morning." "That's correct," Sarah said. The notification included a preliminary data package, encrypted financial records, communication logs, and transaction histories for Sterling Hargrave Capital, covering a 36-month period. Another pause. "Ms. Mitchell, we have been investigating the principals of Sterling Hargrave for approximately 8 months. What arrived in our office this morning represents what I can only describe as a comprehensive evidentiary package for a case we have been building with significantly less documentation." The agent's voice remained professionally measured, but there was something underneath it. Not excitement exactly, but the particular focused energy of someone who has been climbing a long hill and has just spotted the summit. "I need to ask you some questions about the system architecture and the provenance of this data before we proceed." "Of course," Sarah said. She walked to her desk. She opened her laptop. She had a folder ready. She had had it ready for 14 months. "I have documentation of every element of the system's construction, its activation parameters, and its chain of custody protocols. I can share the complete technical file with you this afternoon." "That would be extremely helpful." A beat. "Ms. Mitchell, are you in a safe location?" "Yes." "Are you aware that Sterling Hargrave's legal team is currently attempting to reach you?" Sarah glanced at her phone screen. She had 3 missed calls from a number she didn't recognize, a local number that had started calling at 10:15. "I'm aware. I would strongly advise you not to take those calls or agree to any direct contact with company representatives until you've spoken with your attorney." "My attorney is already briefed," Sarah said. "She's been briefed for 14 months. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. Then Special Agent Okafor said with what sounded like genuine respect, "You are very well prepared, Ms. Mitchell." "I had 11 years to prepare," Sarah said. She ended the call. She sat for a moment. Then she called her attorney, a woman named Claire Donovan, partner at a firm that specialized in whistleblower protection and securities law, and who answered on the first ring because Sarah had texted her at 8:51 that morning with 3 words the clock started. "FBI just called," Sarah said when Claire picked up. "I know. They called me 4 minutes ago." Claire's voice was brisk and energized in the way of someone who had been waiting for precisely this moment. "They're moving faster than I expected. How many hours left on the counter?" Sarah checked her watch. 31 hours, 40 minutes. "All right, that gives us a window. I need you to come to my office this afternoon. Bring everything, the system documentation, the technical file, the audio records, everything." A pause. "Sarah, it's starting." "I know," Sarah said. "How do you feel?" Sarah thought about the question. She looked out her apartment window at the city moving below her, at the ordinary Wednesday afternoon happening in the streets, the people living their lives, the world going about its business. She thought about 11 years. She thought about the boardroom yesterday morning. She thought about Richard's face when he said you were always nothing, and about the sound of the room laughing, and about the weight of the folder she had carried out of that building. "I feel clear," she said. "I feel very clear." Meanwhile, on the 42nd floor of Sterling Hargrave Tower, Brett Calloway had finally reached a number associated with Sarah Mitchell through the HR system, had called it twice, and had received no answer. He had sent an email. He had texted. He brought this information to Richard Sterling at 11:55, standing in the doorway of Richard's private office, with the apologetic posture of a man delivering a message he already knows will not be received well. Richard was standing at his window when Brett entered. He did not turn around. "She's not answering," Brett said. "I know. Should I try?" "She knows we're calling," Richard said. "She's not going to answer." He finally turned from the window. His face in the midday light looked different from the morning. There were lines in it that Brett, who was 31 years old and had worked for Richard for 2 years, had not seen before or had seen and attributed to stress, but which now looked less like temporary stress and more like something older and more structural. "Get me a list of every regulatory body that has oversight jurisdiction over our financial operations. SECFI, NRA, OCCFDIC. Anyone with an interest in our accounts." Brett stared at him. "Why?" "Because I want to know who's going to call us before they call us." He sat down at his desk. "And get Meridian Partners on the phone, the restructuring consultant we hired." "You want to know today? I want to know if he has any experience managing a federal inquiry." Richard's voice was flat and factual, as though he were asking about a vendor specification. "That's all." Brett left. Richard sat at his desk. He was alone for the first time all morning, and the silence in his office was different from the silence he usually engineered, the deliberate, commanding quiet of a man who controlled his environment. This silence was something else. This silence had edges. He opened his computer. He pulled up the company's financial dashboard. The screen showed him in clean and simple terms what the system was now doing to his company in real time. 31 pending transfers, all suspended. 14 vendor payment queues, all frozen. 3 banking partner portals, all showing authentication failures. The number in his operating account, which he could see but not touch, which he could read but not move. He stared at those numbers for a long time. At the money he could see. At the money he could not reach. At the money that was sitting perfectly still, perfectly preserved, perfectly visible to anyone who was authorized to look, including, as of this morning, people who had very specific authority and very specific reasons to look very carefully. It was 12:47 in the afternoon, 29 hours, 3 minutes on the counter, and at that exact moment in the lobby of Sterling Hargrave Tower, 2 men and a woman in dark coats walked through the revolving doors and approached the security desk. They showed identification to Gerald, the security guard, who had said goodbye to Sarah Mitchell yesterday morning with genuine regret. Gerald looked at the identification. He looked at the 3 people holding it. He picked up his desk phone and called upstairs. The woman, the one in the center, the one who had shown her badge first, was Special Agent Renata Okafor. She stood in the lobby with the particular stillness of someone who had been in many buildings like this one, at many moments like this one, and who understood that the next few hours were going to require patience, precision, and absolutely no unnecessary movement. She looked around the lobby. She looked at the elevator bank. She looked at the building directory mounted on the marble wall floor after floor of executive suites, financial departments, operational offices, all the architecture of an empire that had been running in its deepest layers on borrowed time. Gerald came back on the line and said with audible nervousness that Mr. Sterling was unavailable. Special Agent Okafor smiled politely. "That's fine," she said. "We're happy to wait." She sat down in one of the lobby chairs. Her two colleagues sat beside her. They did not look at their phones. They did not fidget. They simply waited with the absolute unhurried certainty of people who know that time is on their side. Upstairs, Brett Calloway burst into Richard Sterling's office without knocking a thing he had never done in 2 years of employment, and said in a voice that was 2 registers higher than normal, "There are FBI agents in the lobby." Richard did not move for 3 full seconds. Then he said very quietly, "How many Ms. 3? Did they present a warrant?" I don't know." Gerald called up. He said they said they're happy to wait." Richard turned back to his window. He looked out at the city 30 miles in every direction, his world, the world he had built and named, and pressed his identity into every corner of. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he picked up his phone and called his private attorney, not the company's legal team, not outside counsel, but the attorney who had his personal retainer and who knew things that no one else in his professional life knew. The call connected on the second ring. "They're here," Richard said. A pause. Then his attorney said 4 words that Richard had spent 40 years in business never expecting to hear directed at him. "Don't say anything yet." 28 hours, 44 minutes on the counter. Sarah Mitchell was in a taxi on her way to Claire Donovan's office, a leather briefcase on her lap containing 11 years of her life's most important work. Her phone buzzed. It was a text from Kevin Cho, 3 words, no punctuation, exactly what she would have expected from a 24-year-old who had just seen something that changed his understanding of the world he worked in. The text said, "They're really here." Sarah read it. She put her phone back in her bag. She looked out the taxi window at the city she had lived in for 20 years, the buildings going past the ordinary afternoon, continuing its ordinary business. She thought about a moment 4 years ago when she had sat in a server room at 2 in the morning alone, writing code into the foundation of a system that a man had already stopped deserving, building a truth that she knew, with the cold and patient certainty of someone who understood systems deeply, would eventually surface. Truth always does. That was the thing about it. You could bury it. You could route around it. You could fire the person maintaining it and throw their folder across a conference table and laugh while the room applauded. But the truth was a system too. And systems, if they are well built, do exactly what they were designed to do. The taxi pulled up in front of Claire Donovan's building. Sarah paid the driver. She picked up her briefcase. She stepped out onto the sidewalk. 28 hours, 31 minutes, and counting. 28 hours. 31 minutes on the counter when Sarah Mitchell walked into Claire Donovan's office, and the world outside Sterling Hargrave Tower had absolutely no idea what was about to happen to one of the most powerful financial empires in the northeastern United States. That was the thing about collapses at this scale. They didn't announce themselves. They began quietly in server rooms and lobby chairs and taxi rides across a city that kept moving, indifferent and continuous, while the architecture of someone's entire life came apart at its foundation. Claire Donovan was 58 years old, small, sharp-eyed, and possessed of the specific energy of a woman who had spent 30 years in a legal field that routinely attempted to exhaust and discourage people exactly like her. She had the kind of face that looked permanently skeptical, not because she distrusted people, but because she had learned through long experience that the first version of any story was almost never the complete one. When Sarah walked through her office door with the leather briefcase and the composed expression and the particular stillness that Claire had come to recognize over 14 months of working together, Claire stood up from her desk and said without preamble, "Sit down and tell me everything that's happened since this morning." Qui sait? Sarah sat. She opened the briefcase. She talked for 40 minutes without stopping, and Claire took notes on a yellow legal pad in her small, precise handwriting, asking questions only when Sarah paused, and those questions were always exactly the right questions, the ones that went to the precise legal and evidentiary pressure points that needed to be established before anything else could move forward. When Sarah finished, Claire set down her pen. She looked at her notes. She looked at Sarah. "The FBI has the automated data package." "Yes." "The SEC received notification this morning through the whistleblower protocol." "Yes." "And you have audio recordings?" 47 of them, Sarah said, spanning 3 years, all legally obtained under single-party consent laws in this jurisdiction. Claire nodded slowly. "And Richard's legal team is going to argue that the system itself, the GHOST protocol, the preservation mode, the automated notification constitutes unauthorized manipulation of company infrastructure. They're going to try to frame you as the perpetrator." "I know." "Which means the recordings become critical, not just as evidence of his fraud, as evidence of your intent. We need to establish clearly that you built the system as a protection mechanism after internal reporting failed, not as a weapon." Claire tapped her pen on the notepad. "Can you document the internal reporting attempts?" Sarah reached into the briefcase and produced a second folder. Email records, meeting notes, the compliance report, and its deletion timestamp, and signed statements from 2 colleagues who witnessed the reporting attempts. Claire took the folder. She opened it. She read the first 2 pages. Something in her expression shifted, not dramatically, but in the way of a chess player who has just seen that the board is more favorable than she initially assessed. "You have the deletion record, the actual timestamp of when the compliance report was removed from the system." "With the user credentials of the person who deleted it," Sarah said. "Marcus Webb's credentials, which either means Marcus deleted it himself or someone with access to his credentials did." Claire looked up from the folder. "Marcus Webb, yes. The same Marcus Webb who walked out of this morning's meeting and said he needed to make calls privately." "Yes." Claire set the folder down. She leaned back in her chair. "Sarah, I need to ask you something directly, and I need you to answer me directly." "Of course." "Is there any element of what you built, any component of the preservation system, any part of the automated response protocol that could be characterized as designed to harm the company rather than to preserve evidence?" Sarah looked at her steadily. "The system does not destroy anything. It does not corrupt anything. It does not steal anything. It preserves records and prevents the movement of assets that were fraudulently obtained. The only people it harms are people who were in the process of committing harm." Claire held her gaze for a moment. Then she nodded once with finality. "All right, then we are ready." She picked up her phone. "I'm calling Renata Okafor back. We're going in together." It was 2:19 in the afternoon. 26 hours, 41 minutes on the counter, and in the lobby of Sterling Hargrave Tower, Special Agent Okafor was still sitting in the same chair she had chosen 3 hours earlier, with the same unhurried patience when her phone rang and she answered it, and listened for 90 seconds, and then looked at the 2 agents beside her and said quietly, "We're going up." Gerald, the security guard, called upstairs. This time he did not ask if Mr. Sterling was available. He simply said, "The FBI agents are coming up. They have a warrant." The warrant had been signed 40 minutes earlier by a federal judge who had reviewed a 60-page affidavit prepared over the previous 8 months and supplemented that morning with the automated data package from Sarah's preservation system. The affidavit detailed 17 counts of wire fraud, 3 counts of securities fraud, 2 counts of money laundering, and 1 count of obstruction of justice in connection with the deletion of an internal compliance report 14 months ago. Richard Sterling's private attorney, a man named Gordon Rail, who had been practicing white-collar defense for 31 years and who had seen a great many bad situations in his career, arrived on the 42nd floor at 2:37, slightly out of breath, and found Richard standing in his office doorway waiting for him with an expression that Gordon had also seen before. Not panic, not anger, but the particular tight-jawed composure of a man who had spent decades winning by controlling the environment around him and who was now in an environment that he could not control and knew it. "Tell me where we are," Richard said. Gordon pulled him back into the office and closed the door. "They have a warrant. That means they have an affidavit that a federal judge found sufficient for probable cause. That's not a small thing that means they walked into that judge's chambers with something solid. He set his briefcase on the desk. Have you said anything to them? They haven't spoken to me directly. They went to the legal team first. Good. That stays the same. You say nothing, not to them, not to your board, not to your CFO, not to anyone on your staff. Gordon opened his briefcase. Where is Marcus Webb right now? Richard's expression shifted slightly. I don't know. He left the meeting this morning and I haven't been able to reach him since. Gordon stopped moving. You haven't been able to reach your CFO. He's not answering. Gordon looked at him for a moment, with the expression of a man recalculating a situation. Richard, if Marcus Webb has spoken to federal investigators before we have, if he's cooperating, Marcus would not. Marcus walked out of your boardroom this morning after confronting you about unauthorized accounts, Gordon said, and his voice was very precise and very level. He has his own exposure here. If he decided that cooperating was a better option than defending, he made that decision hours ago, and there is nothing we can do about it now. He paused. I need you to understand the reality of where we are. This is not a negotiation. This is not a situation you manage by controlling the narrative. The warrant has been issued. The investigation is active. Your job right now, your only job, is to not make it worse. Richard was quiet. He looked at the window. 26 floors below the city moved through its afternoon. He could see the tops of buildings, the geometry of the streets, the small moving shapes of people going about their lives. He had stood at this window hundreds of times and felt the specific satisfaction of surveying a domain. This was the first time the view looked different. This was the first time it looked like something that had already happened rather than something he possessed. What do you think she gave them? He asked. His voice was quieter than Gordon had ever heard it. Gordon knew who he meant without asking. Based on the scope of the warrant, everything. The agents came up at 2:44. They moved through the executive floor with the quiet efficiency of people who had done this many times and who understood that the atmosphere of the action, the controlled pace, the professional courtesy, the absence of drama was itself a tool. They were not theatrical. They did not need to be. Special Agent Okafor led the team. She had a second warrant with her, a document preservation order that covered every server, every device, every file storage system in the building. Her team immediately moved to the server room, where Kevin Cho had been sitting for the past 7 hours, watching the countdown with the vigilant exhaustion of a man who had not slept and who was now watching the thing he had been watching become officially real. Kevin looked up when the agents came in. He looked at their badges. He looked at the preservation order one of them handed to Daniel Forsyth, who had materialized from somewhere down the hall, looking like a man who had aged visibly in a single day. You're going to want to see this, Kevin said to the agent who approached his station. He turned his monitor to face her. He pointed at the counter. The agent, a young woman with a precise manner, looked at the screen. She looked at Kevin. What am I looking at? 25 hours, 52 minutes, Kevin said. When it hits 0, the system enters full preservation mode. Everything locks. But the data package, the evidence archive that's already been transmitted, that went out this morning when the pre-lockdown state activated. She nodded. She made a note. She looked at the screen one more time with the expression of someone adding a piece to a picture she had already largely assembled. Thank you, she said. Please don't touch anything on this system until our technical team clears it. Kevin put his hands in his lap. He looked at the counter. 25 hours, 51 minutes. He thought about the phone call he had made to Sarah Mitchell last night and about what she had said that in a few days someone official was going to want to talk to someone who was in that room. He thought about his personal email, where a detailed time-stamped document describing everything he had observed since 4:17 the previous afternoon was sitting in his drafts folder ready. He opened his personal phone under the desk and moved the document from drafts to send address to his personal attorney's email address, which he had looked up at 3 a.m. in a moment of the specific clarity that sometimes comes with sleeplessness. 2 floors up in the conference room where the morning's meeting had taken place, Special Agent Okafor sat across the table from Gordon Rail and 2 members of Sterling Hargrave's legal team. She placed a document on the table. She pushed it toward them. "This is a list of individuals we intend to interview in connection with this investigation," she said. "We are not here today to conduct those interviews. We are here to execute the preservation order and to formally notify the company of the scope of the investigation. Interviews will be scheduled through counsel." Gordon Rail looked at the list. His face gave nothing away, which was a skill he had spent 31 years developing. But his eyes stopped moving for approximately half a second when they reached the third name on the list. Marcus Webb. "I see," Gordon said. "Mr. Webb is listed as a cooperating witness," Okafor said. She said it the way you would state a weather forecast factually, without emphasis, in a tone that communicated she understood perfectly well what the information meant to the people receiving it. Gordon set the list down. He looked at his colleagues, one of them a woman named Helen Park, who had been with Sterling Hargrave's legal team for 6 years, had gone very still in the way people go still when their brain is moving very fast. "Cooperating witness," Gordon repeated. "That's correct." "Since when?" "I'm not able to share the details of witness cooperation arrangements." Okafor folded her hands on the table. "What I can tell you is that the scope of cooperation is substantial and that it preceded today's events." She paused. "By several months." The room absorbed that. Cooperating witness, several months. Marcus Webb, who had been CFO for 16 years, who had sat in every room, who had signed every document, who had been present for every decision. Marcus Webb had been talking to federal investigators for months, while sitting in the morning meetings, while preparing the restructuring presentation, while laughing when Sarah Mitchell walked out. Helen Park picked up her water glass and set it back down without drinking from it, which was the closest she came to a visible reaction. Gordon gathered his documents with the practiced calm of a man who was saving his response for a room that didn't include federal agents. "We'll be in touch about the interview schedule," he said. Okafor nodded. She stood. She was almost at the door when Gordon said, "Agent Okafor." She turned. "The system, the automated protocol, the woman who built it." He chose his next words carefully. "Is she a subject of this investigation?" Okafor looked at him for a moment. "Sarah Mitchell is a protected whistleblower under federal statute. Her filing was received and accepted 14 months ago." She paused. "She is a witness for the government." Gordon said nothing. Okafor walked out. Helen Park looked at the table for a moment. Then she looked at Gordon. "He doesn't know about the whistleblower filing," she said quietly. "He thinks she built the system as a weapon. He's going to walk into that interview." "I know," Gordon said. "We have to tell him." "I know," Gordon said again. He stood. He picked up his briefcase. He did not look like a man who was looking forward to the next conversation he needed to have. Richard Sterling received the information at 4:03 in the afternoon in his private office, with the door closed, delivered by Gordon Rail, in the flat, factual tone of a doctor delivering a diagnosis that the patient has been avoiding. Sarah had filed as a protected whistleblower 14 months ago. The preservation system was not sabotage. It was evidence collection, legally structured, federally protected, and designed with the specific legal precision of someone who had spent over a year working with a whistleblower attorney to make sure every element of it would survive judicial scrutiny. Marcus Webb had been cooperating with federal investigators for several months. He had provided testimony and documentation regarding the unauthorized accounts. He had done it, Gordon explained, because his own exposure was significant, and cooperation was the clearest path to a reduced outcome. Richard listened to all of it. He sat behind his desk. He did not interrupt. He did not ask questions. He simply listened with the specific enclosed stillness of a man who has run out of moves and knows it. When Gordon finished, Richard said, "The audio recordings she mentioned in the filing summary, do we know what's on them?" "We don't have access to the filing summary," Gordon said. "We don't know the full contents." "She recorded conversations," Richard said. It was not a question, it was a man working through a memory going back through 3 years of conversations in private offices and closed conference rooms and dinners and phone calls, searching for the moment or moments that would be most damaging heard by a federal jury. She was in rooms. She was in every room. "Yes," Gordon said. Richard was quiet for a long time. Outside his window, the afternoon was moving toward evening, the light changing over the city. 23 hours, 16 minutes on the counter that Kevin Cho was still watching in the server room below. "Can we resolve this?" Richard asked finally. "A settlement, cooperation. whatever they need. Gordon Rail looked at him with the expression of a man who has delivered too many hard truths in one day and has one more to go. Richard, they don't need anything from you. They have the data package, the recordings, a cooperating CFO, and a fully protected whistleblower who spent 11 years documenting everything. He paused. The only question at this point is how you choose to face it. Richard Sterling looked at his window. At the city, at the world he had built, and the view he had engineered to make other people feel small. At the 30 miles of skyline that he had surveyed from this chair in this building with this certainty for 22 years. He looked at it for a long time. Then he said very quietly to no one in particular, "She really did build everything." Gordon didn't respond. There was nothing to say to that. It was 4:47 in the afternoon. The federal investigators were on the floor below, working through servers and files and hard drives with the methodical patience of people who understood that the truth properly preserved yields everything eventually. Kevin Cho was at his station watching the counter cross below 23 hours. Amy Torres was in a conference room 2 floors down, being interviewed by a junior agent, her spreadsheet open on her personal laptop, her voice steady and her account precise. And Sarah Mitchell was sitting in Claire Donovan's office on the other side of the city, going through the 47 audio recordings one by one, flagging the most critical moments with colored tabs, building the case that she had been building for 3 years, with the same patient, methodical attention to consequence that she had applied to everything in her professional life. One of the recordings was dated 14 months ago. It was 11 minutes long. In it, a man's voice, unmistakably Richard Sterling's voice, recorded legally and clearly described in specific terms a wire transfer structure that was designed to move company assets into offshore accounts without appearing on any auditable financial statement. He described it in the tone of a man giving routine operational instructions. He described it to Marcus Webb, who said on the recording, "Yes, I understand." Sarah listened to it once. She put a red tab on it. She set it aside. Claire looked at the red tab. That one? That one, Sarah said. Claire nodded. She wrote something on her legal pad. She underlined it twice. The jury, she said, is going to hear a man in his own voice describe exactly what he did. Yes, Sarah said. And then they're going to hear 11 years of documentation supporting every word. Yes. Claire set down her pen. She looked at Sarah with an expression that was not quite pride. It was something more complicated than that, something that had more history in it, more weight, more understanding of what it cost to do something the right way when the wrong way was so much faster and so much easier. You know what the hardest part of cases like this is, she said. Sarah waited. The waiting, Claire said. Most people in your position, they would have moved too fast. They would have reported too early with not enough documentation, and the company would have buried it and discredited them, and it would have been over. She paused. You waited until the case was complete, until there was nothing left to argue with. Sarah looked at the stack of folders on the desk. 11 years of work, 47 recordings, 3 years of financial records, a system that had run invisible and patient in the foundation of a building whose owner had never understood what it really was. I learned from the system, she said quietly. A good system doesn't react. It waits for the right conditions, and then it does exactly what it was designed to do. 22 hours, 9 minutes. The counter was still running, and in a federal courthouse across the city, a judge was reviewing the preliminary evidence package with the focused attention of someone who understood that what had arrived in her chambers that morning was not a routine financial crimes case. It was something more comprehensive, more carefully constructed, and more complete than almost anything she had seen in 20 years on the bench. She read for a long time. Then she looked at the assistant U.S. attorney sitting across from her. This is a strong case, she said. Yes, Your Honor, the attorney said. The system that generated the evidence package, the automated preservation protocol. Is it still active? Yes, it completes its cycle in approximately 22 hours. The judge looked at the document in her hands. At the numbers, at the recordings index, at the testimony summary from a cooperating witness who had been inside the operation for 16 years, at the whistleblower filing timestamp 14 months ago, carefully prepared, legally airtight. Someone spent a very long time building this, she said, 11 years, the attorney said. The judge was quiet for a moment. Then she set the document down. Move forward, she said. 22 hours, 9 minutes on the counter when the federal judge said, move forward, and the machinery of consequence, the real machinery, the kind that no amount of money or influence or carefully cultivated power can stop once it reaches a certain velocity, began moving with a speed that Sterling Hargrave Tower had never been designed to withstand. The arrests did not happen that night. They happened the following morning, which was a Thursday, gray and cold, the kind of November morning that feels like the city itself has decided to be serious. Richard Sterling was at his apartment, not the office his attorney had advised him to go home to stay quiet to wait, when the knock came at 7:42. 2 agents, a warrant, the specific, procedural courtesy of people who have done this before and understand that the performance of civility in a moment like this is itself a form of power. Richard opened the door in a bathrobe. He looked at the warrant. He looked at the agents. He said nothing, which was the one piece of Gordon Rail's advice he was able to follow. He dressed. He came out. He walked to the elevator of the building where he had lived for 14 years, and the doorman, a man who had greeted him by name thousands of times, looked at the floor as he passed. That detail would stay with Richard longer than almost anything else. Not the handcuffs, which came later and briefly. Not the processing, which was humiliating in the specific way that bureaucratic procedures are humiliating when applied to a man who has spent decades being exempted from them. Not even the holding room, which was small and indifferent and absolutely unlike any room he had occupied in 20 years. It was the doorman looking at the floor. That was the moment Richard Sterling understood, with a clarity that no boardroom presentation had ever delivered, that the world he had constructed around himself was already gone. Sarah Mitchell was in Claire Donovan's office when the call came through confirming the arrests. It was 8:17 in the morning. She was on her second coffee. She had slept 4 hours, not because she couldn't sleep, but because there had been work to do, details to finalize, documents to organize in the precise sequence that Claire needed them for the grand jury presentation scheduled for the following week. Claire's assistant knocked on the door and said, "Agent Okafor is on line 1. Claire picked up. She listened for 40 seconds. She said, "Thank you, Renata." She hung up. She looked at Sarah. "Sterling is in custody. Webb surrendered this morning at 6 with his attorney. Cooperation agreement already signed." Sarah set down her coffee cup. She was quiet for a moment. "How do you feel?" Claire asked. It was the same question she had asked 2 days ago in this same office, and she asked it again, not because she expected a different answer, but because she understood that the answer to that question changes at different moments in a story like this one. Sarah thought about it. "The same way I feel when a system runs correctly," she said. "Not surprised, just confirmed." Claire nodded. She understood that. After 30 years of this work, she understood it exactly. The grand jury convened 9 days later. Sarah sat in the hallway outside the chamber for 3 hours before she was called in, and she used those 3 hours the way she used most waiting time, thinking through every sequence, every potential question, every point at which the logic of her account might be challenged, and how she would respond. She was not nervous. She had discovered somewhere in the last 4 years of building and waiting and preparing that she had exhausted her capacity for fear about this particular situation. She had looked at every worst-case scenario so many times that they had lost their power to frighten her. What remained was only clarity. When she walked into the chamber, she sat down. She looked at the jury, 23 people, ordinary people, people who had come in that morning with their coffee and their ordinary lives and their ordinary understanding of the world. She looked at them and felt something unexpected, gratitude. These were the people the system was ultimately built for. Not the regulators, not the attorneys, not the judges. These 23 people sitting in this room who deserved to make financial decisions and investment decisions and retirement decisions in a world where the numbers they were shown reflected reality. The assistant U.S. attorney was a young man named Thomas Reyes, young enough that Sarah had initially been surprised when Claire told her he was lead on the case, and then had reviewed his record and understood immediately why he had been chosen. He was precise, methodical, and had an instinct for the exact moment when a complex financial story became emotionally comprehensible to a non-specialist audience. He started with the simple question, Ms. Mitchell, can you describe your role at Sterling Hargrave Capital? Sarah described it. She described it clearly and completely without jargon and without minimization in the plain language of someone explaining a technical system to intelligent people who haven't encountered it before. She described what she built. She described why. She described what she found when she started looking carefully at the numbers that passed through the system she had built. And when you found evidence of financial irregularities, Reyes said, "What did you do?" "I reported it internally," Sarah said. First to the CFO, then to 2 board members, then through the company's formal compliance reporting system. And what happened to those reports? The verbal reports were dismissed. The formal compliance report was deleted from the system 14 days after I submitted it. A murmur in the chamber, quiet but present. "Deleted," Reyes said. "By whom?" The deletion was performed using the credentials of Marcus Webb, the chief financial officer. "And after the deletion, what did you do?" "I contacted a whistleblower attorney," Sarah said, "and I began building the evidence preservation system." Reyes nodded. He walked to the evidence table. He picked up a tablet. He pressed play. Richard Sterling's voice filled the chamber, clear, unhurried, and utterly specific. 11 minutes of a man describing in his own words the architecture of a fraud that had moved hundreds of millions of dollars through structures designed to be invisible to auditors, regulators, and the investors who had trusted him with their money. He used specific account numbers. He used specific jurisdictions. He used the names of the structures with the casual familiarity of someone discussing routine operations, because to him, by that point, it had become routine. The chamber was completely silent while the recording played. Sarah watched the jurors' faces. She watched the moment she could see it move across the room like a wave when they stopped being people listening to a financial fraud case and became people who were angry. Not abstractly, legally angry, personally angry in the way people become when they understand that something was done to them and to people they know and to a system they relied on, and that it was done deliberately and cynically by someone who never believed there would be consequences. When the recording ended, Reyes looked at the jury. He said nothing for a moment. He let the silence work. Then he said, "Ms. Mitchell, after you were terminated on the morning of November 12th, what did you expect to happen?" Sarah looked at the jury. "I expected the system to work," she said, "the one I built and the one we're all sitting inside of right now." The grand jury returned an indictment on all counts 14 days later, 17 counts of wire fraud, 3 counts of securities fraud, 2 counts of money laundering, 1 count of obstruction of justice. The indictment was 19 pages long and referenced in its supporting documentation the automated data archive that Sarah's preservation system had generated, a 4,300-page evidentiary package that had arrived in federal investigators' hands with timestamps, chain of custody documentation, and encryption certificates that made it, in the words of the federal prosecutor who reviewed it, the most comprehensively authenticated digital evidence package she had encountered in 22 years of practice. Richard Sterling's defense team spent 4 months attempting to characterize the preservation system as unauthorized sabotage. They filed 3 motions arguing that the automated data collection violated the company's proprietary information protocols. They argued that Sarah had built a system designed to harm the company. They argued that the evidence it generated should be inadmissible. The judge denied all 3 motions. In her ruling on the 3rd, she wrote 11 words that became, in the months that followed, the most quoted sentence from the entire case. "The truth cannot be characterized as a weapon merely because it is inconvenient." The trial began on a Monday morning in March, 8 months after the November morning when Richard Sterling had stood 2 seats away from Sarah Mitchell in a boardroom and told her she was nothing. The courtroom was full. It was the kind of case that fills courtrooms not because of celebrity, but because of scale, because of the specific public anger that accumulates when it becomes clear that someone has been stealing from ordinary people's futures with extraordinary sophistication and absolutely no remorse. Richard sat at the defense table in a suit that was slightly less carefully chosen than his usual standard, which was a small thing that several people in the courtroom noticed and that communicated something true about his current condition. He had aged in 8 months in the way people age when the structure that was holding them up turns out to have been external rather than internal. Without the tower and the title and the 42-floor view and the maitre d' who knew his name, there was less of him than there had appeared to be. Sarah sat in the gallery on the prosecution's side for the first 2 weeks of the trial. She was there every day. She arrived at 8:30. She sat in the same seat. She watched the proceedings with the focused attention of someone who had spent 11 years preparing for exactly this room and who was not going to miss a moment of it. On the 3rd week of the trial, Thomas Reyes called her to the stand. She walked to the witness box. She sat down. She looked at the courtroom, the jury, the judge, the gallery, the defense table, where Richard Sterling sat with his attorneys arranged around him like a formation. She looked at Richard directly. He looked back at her, and for a moment, just a moment, 2 or 3 seconds, the courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Then Reyes said, "Ms. Mitchell, please tell the jury about the morning of November 12th. She turned to the jury. She told them. She told them about the boardroom and the presentation, and Richard's walk down the length of the table and the sound of the room laughing. She told them without drama and without performance, in the same clear, plain language she had used in the grand jury chamber, because the facts of the morning were dramatic enough on their own and did not require decoration. She told them about the USB drive in her pocket, about the 72-hour window, about the decision she had made standing in the elevator watching her reflection in the brushed steel doors. "Why didn't you stop the system?" Reyes asked. "When you left, you had the key. You could have entered the confirmation code, and the preservation mode would never have activated." Sarah looked at the jury. "Because the evidence needed to be preserved," she said, "and because the people who put their money into this company needed someone to preserve it for them, and because 11 years ago I agreed to be responsible for the integrity of this company's systems." She paused. "Being fired doesn't end that responsibility. If anything, it clarifies it." A juror in the second row, a woman in her 60s with reading glasses on a chain around her neck, who had been taking notes throughout the trial, stopped writing and looked up at Sarah with an expression that was not quite a smile, but was something in the same family. The cross-examination lasted 2 days. Richard's lead defense attorney was a formidable woman named Constance Lyle, who had defended 3 major white-collar cases in the previous decade and won 2 of them. She was intelligent, prepared, and relentless, and she approached Sarah with the professional respect of an opponent who recognized the quality of what she was up against. She tried 4 angles. She tried to characterize Sarah as a disgruntled employee acting from personal motivation. Sarah calmly produced the whistleblower filing timestamp 14 months before she was fired, and noted that a person acting from personal grievance does not typically file federal whistleblower protections before they have been personally wronged. Constance moved on. She tried to argue that the preservation system exceeded Sarah's authorized technical scope. Sarah produced the original system design contract from 11 years ago, signed by Richard Sterling, which granted her explicit authority over all authentication and data management protocols. Constance moved on. She tried to suggest that the audio recordings had been obtained improperly. Sarah's attorney had anticipated this and had submitted a 40-page legal brief on single-party consent recording law 3 weeks before the trial began. The judge had already ruled the recordings admissible. Constance moved on. Then she tried the angle that everyone in the courtroom had been waiting for, the one that Richard had apparently believed was his strongest card. She stood in front of the witness box and looked at Sarah with an expression of careful, measured challenge. "Ms. Mitchell," she said, "isn't it true that this entire system, this preservation protocol, this automated evidence collection, this so-called dead man's switch was designed not to protect the company, but to destroy it, to take revenge on a man who you believed had undervalued you?" The courtroom was very quiet. Sarah looked at Constance Lyle. She looked at her for a moment with the particular patience of someone who has prepared for a question so thoroughly that the question itself feels like an old friend. "If I wanted to destroy Sterling Hargrave," Sarah said, "I would have done nothing. I would have let the fraud continue until the company collapsed on its own, which, based on the trajectory of the financial irregularities, would have happened within 4 to 6 years. She paused. "What I built preserved the company's assets, preserved its records, and prevented the movement of fraudulently obtained funds. The system protected the investors. It protected the employees. It protected the institution." She looked directly at Richard Sterling across the courtroom. "The only thing it destroyed was the ability to keep lying." Constance Lyle had no further questions. The jury deliberated for 2 days and 4 hours. They came back on a Wednesday afternoon. Sarah was in the courtroom. She was in the same seat she had occupied every day for 3 weeks. She sat with her hands in her lap and her back straight and her face composed in the expression that had become over the course of this story its defining image, not triumph, not anger, not vindication, but the particular settled clarity of someone who has done what needed to be done and has arrived, at last at the moment where the doing and the outcome meet. The foreperson stood. The judge asked for the verdict. The foreperson read it. Guilty on all counts. All 17 wire fraud counts. All 3 securities fraud counts. Both money laundering counts. The obstruction count. Guilty, guilty, guilty. Each word landed in the courtroom like a stone dropped into still water, the ripples moving outward through the room, through the gallery, through the people sitting in the rows behind Sarah, who had invested in Sterling Hargrave and lost money and spent 8 months waiting for this room and this moment and these words. Richard Sterling did not react visibly. He sat at the defense table with his hands flat and his jaw set, and he looked at the table and he was, for perhaps the first time in his professional life, entirely without a move to make. The sentencing came 6 weeks later. 25 years in federal prison. Asset forfeiture covering the full value of the fraudulently obtained transfers. Restitution to investors totaling $218 million to be paid from the remaining legitimate assets of the estate. When the sentence was read, Sarah was in Claire Donovan's office. She had chosen not to be in the courtroom for the sentencing. She had said everything she needed to say from the witness stand. The sentencing was a number, an important number, a just number, but a number that belonged to the legal process and not to her. What belonged to her was already done. She heard the sentence from Claire, who got a text from Thomas Reyes while they were having coffee. Claire read the text. She set her phone face down on the desk. She looked at Sarah. 25 years, she said. Sarah nodded. She looked out the window. The city moved through its January afternoon cold and bright and indifferent, in the way cities always are continuing, regardless of what has just been decided in any particular room. What now? Claire asked. Sarah had been thinking about this question for a long time. Not obsessively, she was not a person who organized her inner life around obsession, but thoughtfully in the quiet spaces between the legal preparations and the interviews and the grand jury and the trial, she had been returning to a question that was in its way the most important one this entire experience had raised. Not what happens to Richard Sterling, not what the verdict says, but what you build next. After you have spent 4 years watching something decay, and 2 years ensuring the decay was documented, and 1 year watching the documentation become consequence. What you build next. She had an answer. She had been working on it for 8 months in the evenings, in the hours between the legal work and sleep building, something new. The way she built everything methodically, with attention to consequence, starting from the foundation. 6 months after the sentencing, Sarah Mitchell incorporated a new company. She named it Meridian True, not after the consulting firm that Richard had hired to replace her, which had quietly dissolved its contract with Sterling Hargrave within 2 weeks of the arrests, but after the Meridian line, the 0 point, the baseline from which everything is measured. The name meant something specific to her. It meant start from truth and build from there. She acquired the former Sterling Hargrave headquarters building in a bankruptcy auction 14 months after the sentencing. The purchase price was a fraction of what the building had been worth when Richard Sterling's name was on it. She renovated the 42nd floor first. She tore out the wall of windows that had been engineered to make visitors feel small. She replaced them with glass on all sides floor to ceiling, so that the light came in from every direction and the view was something you stood inside rather than something that was shown to you as proof of someone else's dominance. She moved her desk to the center of the room, not the head of a table. She invited her team to arrange themselves around it. Meridian True's operational model was built on a single principle that Sarah had developed over 11 years of watching what happened when that principle was absent. Total transparency, not as a marketing phrase, not as a values statement on a website, but as an operational reality encoded into the system's architecture. Every account visible to every stakeholder with an interest in it. Every financial decision traceable through a clear and auditable chain. Every compliance report preserved automatically and simultaneously, submitted to both internal and external oversight. She hired Kevin Cho as head of systems architecture. He was 25 by then and had spent the previous year completing a security certification and building a portfolio that had attracted attention from 3 larger firms, all of which he had turned down. When Sarah called him, he answered on the first ring and said yes before she had finished describing the role. She hired Amy Torres as Director of Financial Operations. Amy had spent the previous year cooperating with federal investigators whose technical team had described her spreadsheet documentation as among the most clearly organized financial analysis they had received from a non-specialist witness. Amy had cried when Sarah called her briefly and without embarrassment, and then had asked 4 sharp, precise questions about the role's scope and reporting structure, and Sarah had answered all 4 with the completeness they deserved. She did not hire anyone who had been in the boardroom on November 12th. Not out of punishment. Punishment was not the architecture of what she was building. But because she understood with the systems designer clarity that governed how she saw the world, that the people who had laughed that morning had revealed something true about how they processed the relationship between power and accountability, and that was not a foundation she wanted to build on. David Park, her former assistant, she hired as her chief of staff. He was 27 now and had spent the intervening months in therapy working on the professional boundaries she had been coaching him on, and he was better for it, steadier, more measured, still empathetic, but now in control of it, rather than controlled by it. He walked into the renovated 42nd floor on his first day, looked around at the light and the desk in the center, and the absence of the architecture of intimidation that had defined the room before, and said quietly, "It's completely different." That's the point, Sarah said. Meridian True's first-year revenue was modest. Sarah had not designed it for speed. She had designed it for durability, which is a different thing and requires a different patience. But the investors who came to her that first year came because of what had happened, because of the trial and the verdict, and the 11 words the judge had written in her ruling, and because there was a specific and growing market, it turned out, for a financial institution that had been built by someone who had proven at considerable personal cost that she meant what she said about integrity. By the end of the 3rd year, Meridian True had 312 employees, 740 investor clients, and a compliance record that 3 separate regulatory bodies had cited publicly as a model for the industry. The 42nd floor had become something that people in the financial world talked about, not because of the view, but because of what happened in the meetings there, because of the way information moved openly and completely, without the strategic withholding and careful misdirection that governed most rooms at that altitude. Sarah was 56 years old. She had silver in her hair that she still did not hide. She wore the same kind of flat leather shoes she had always worn for the same reasons. She still read financial documents the way other people read novels, deeply with attention, looking for the places where the narrative didn't quite fit the numbers underneath it. On the day that Meridian True's 3rd annual report was published, a document that was in a deliberate and specific departure from industry standard available in its complete form to every stakeholder, every employee, and every member of the public who wanted to read it. Sarah sat at her desk in the center of the 42nd floor and read it from the first page to the last. It was accurate. It was complete. It was exactly what it said it was. She set it down. She looked out through the floor-to-ceiling glass at the city she had lived in for 20 years, at the ordinary afternoon, moving through its ordinary rhythms, at the world, continuing its continuous, indifferent motion. She thought about a Tuesday morning in November 3 years ago, when a man had thrown her folder across a conference table and told her she was nothing, and her room had laughed and she had walked out through a door that closed behind her with a quiet, precise click. She thought about an elevator and a USB drive and a reflection in brushed steel. She thought about 43 hours and a counter that moved patient and mechanical 1 second at a time. She thought about 23 jurors and 11 words and a sentence read aloud in a courtroom while she sat in her attorney's office drinking coffee and looking out at the city. She had not built any of it for revenge. That was the thing people still sometimes misunderstood even now. They wanted the story to be about revenge because revenge is a clean narrative. Someone is wronged, someone fights back, someone wins. It is satisfying in the way of a closed loop, a balanced equation, a system returned to equilibrium through equal and opposite force. But what Sarah had built was not a weapon aimed backward. It was a structure aimed forward. It was the answer to a question she had been asking since the first time she had looked at a set of numbers that didn't add up and understood that someone had made them not add up on purpose. The question was simple. What do you build in a world where the people with the most power have decided that the rules don't apply to them? You build something that makes the rules apply anyway. You build it carefully. You build it completely. You build it with the patient, methodical attention of someone who understands that a system built on truth doesn't need to fight. It only needs to run. Richard Sterling was serving his sentence in a federal correctional facility 3 states away. The building that had his name on it had a different name now. The boardroom where he had stood 2 seats from Sarah Mitchell and made his declaration had different walls, different light, a different desk, in a different position, and a different woman sitting at it who had built everything in that room with her own hands and who intended to keep building for as long as the work required. She picked up her coffee. She looked at the city. She thought about all of it, about what it cost and what it produced, and what it meant to spend 11 years doing the right thing in the right way, at the right speed, even when the right speed was agonizingly slow, and the right way was invisible to everyone around you, and the right thing was something you were doing entirely alone in server rooms at 2 in the morning. She thought about what it felt like at the end of all of that to look at what you had built and know that it was exactly what it was supposed to be. Then she picked up the next file. She opened it. She started reading. Because the work was not finished. The work was never finished. And that, in the end, was not a burden. That was the point. Some people build walls to keep the truth out. Sarah Mitchell had spent her life building systems to let it in. And the difference between those two things, the difference between a structure designed to hide and a structure designed to reveal, is the only difference that when everything else has been stripped away, actually matters. She had proven that. She had proven it completely, and no one ever again would be able to call her nothing.